we did like a podcast. So please, I cut you off. Could you continue with what you were saying? We're talking about learning and education.
Oh wait, hold on. Now I even hold on. It's gonna come back to me. Of course, I forgot to remember it.
you, you mentioned having a friend who became a doctor later in life because
Right.
developmentally disabled
Oh, what I was gonna
children.
say is, yeah. So what I was thinking about it, so the context of this is talking about how people think your early life, like like school or college or and I think this kind of continues, right? Like it's always relative. Your first job, your first sales job, your first remote job, your first AE job, whatever. Like the
Hmm.
first thing always feels like this big deal because it's usually the milestone, right? So I used to coach soccer. What I would see is like I coached a group of boys from like basically like 10 years old through like 17, I guess, is when they would have
Hmm.
been sort of like aging out. And there were a lot of parents. So, you have kids that are like really good and really want to be there. You have kids who are really good and like totally wish they never had to come do anything.
Yeah.
You have kids that are okay and really want to be there. And then you have some kids who are okay and kind of don't want to be there. Right. And that's sort of like what coaching youth sports is like, right? And it's real
Hmm.
interesting because sometimes you're like, oh, our best player, like we always win when this kid's here and plays this position, but they're like they'll skip your stuff to go practice for something else, like. And so, what was interesting though is there were a lot of parents who were really focused on like their kids, like success, right? And they're very focused on what position. They're focused on how much they played, like they're focused on their development, right? Which is all cool stuff. Like that's the right things to kind of think about, but this would legitimately be like 13-year-old kids, and I'd have these parents that are like telling me, in order to make the college team XYZ, you know what I mean? Like
Oh.
this kid, oh, hey, this kid, the way he's growing based on his physical stature, he's going to be much better here, at the college game. And so instead
Hmm.
of playing here where they fit today or where they like to play, we want them to, and so everyone has these big plans, and you're like this coach, so you're kind of balancing like the individuals and then the team, and like some of it's just kind of like randomness too, right? Like especially in youth sports, they teach you as a coach not to be overly like you don't want to just pigeonhole like this kid only plays this position all the time. There's value to sort of like like let there be some mixture, let there be some sort of experience to the thing. And so I just remember having these kids that were like so focused, and then I had a teammate who was he had fallen into the category of really, really naturally good, didn't really care to be there at first because he was a basketball player, right? He was wicked good at basketball, like point guard type guy, really good at shooting, crazy fast, but he was tiny, right? Very undersized. And so what happened was in freshman year of high school, um, let me see if I get this right. Freshman year of high school, he played basketball. Sophomore year of high school, realized can't play basketball anymore. Like it's not going to work. So he was going to play soccer, but had like a 1.0 GPA. Just like couldn't care less about school. Like just like terrible, maybe less than
Yeah.
that. And so he couldn't play on the team, right? And so he couldn't play. And so not being able to play like woke him up as a sophomore in high school, right? So then that summer or like that year, not being able to play, he goes and he trains really hard and he becomes really, really, really good. So we're on the same club team, right? And so he just becomes like wicked good, like crazy dedicated, like totally changes him, right? Like really, really good for this kid. And so he becomes crazy good. So as a junior, he tries out, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, Ben is just so good! Like, he's gonna make the varsity, all these things." And he doesn't. He gets cut from varsity and put on JV, and it was kind of like an ordeal, and people, and essentially it was like, okay, well, you'd been like a 1.0 student, so like they didn't, it's kind of like the good old high school gatekeeping where they're like, we don't want you up here, like
Yeah.
we're gonna punish you, child, by spending another season in JV. And so, a lot of kids maybe would quit or would not take it that seriously. He instead goes out, just like breaks the goal scoring record, just like just scoring ridiculous amounts. He's just crushing it, killing it, right? And so just breaks a bunch of records in JV, right? First year getting to play in high school, high school soccer, like not even on the varsity team. The next year he plays on varsity, kills it, and gets a full ride scholarship to go play soccer, right? At San
Oh
Jose
wow.
State, right? Not some big deal school, but like the point was that I saw this guy. So I have these like 13-year-old kids' parents telling me how consequential it is that I'm not playing their kid at, right mid, and instead we're using him as a center mid because, and I'm like,
Yeah.
bro, I just watched this kid like spend basically 2 seasons and go from like 1.0 to, JV star to varsity star. So scholarship. Yeah, so anyways, I think, and like to me the meta thing that applies, literally even like sales work, whatever, is like people always think that the journey is like this really long thing, but it takes so little, like win win win, like just a little bit of momentum can really sort of change someone's trajectory. And I think the longer people sit not having that win happen, it's almost like the less they believe in it, which
Hmm.
is the bummer, because it's like you just need the little asymmetrical win. Like you just need that, junior season, senior season, all of a sudden boom, you're on the team. And when you're like 13 years old, it's like, hey, just go learn to have enough fun that by the time you're 17, 18, you still want to play, right? Because that's the other thing, is a lot of those families, they were so focused, so stressed out early. By the time their kid is like a sophomore, junior, senior, that
Hmm.
kid's like, I'm not playing. They're like, I can't wait to be done. As soon as they turn 18, they're like, I'm out, never doing this again. They go to some crazy school, become the party animal that their kid was always scared of, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like they're just rejecting that like intense pressure placed on top of them for something that's supposed to be like fun. And by the way, playing college soccer doesn't do anything for you financially.
Right.
Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like there's,
Yeah.
it's like, this isn't like this isn't the gateway to like, your future. You're not, like, I don't know, in some Brazilian favela, right? Like trying to
Hmm.
become the next Neymar, trying to change your life or something. Like this is like, suburban children's soccer. Go have some fun.
Right. No, 100%. And actually, I found myself this weekend, how this conversation started. We were talking about my kids, and we're looking at different schools. Um, they currently attend a Montessori school. We're looking at a Waldorf school. There's all these different things. And I found myself fighting with the pride of what can my kids achieve, right? Because the question is like, one of my sons is in this like buffer zone for, does he go to first grade or does he just do kindergarten again? There's like a learning curve going from one method of learning to the other. And I'm like, hey, you can go to first grade. He's a smart kid, but the teachers are telling me like, it's okay. You're not going to regret slowing down childhood if he did kindergarten again. He's just going to play more
Yeah,
and make more friends. And there was this thing in my head, like, but what if people think he had to repeat kindergarten, which
yeah,
doesn't matter, right? In the grand scheme of things, like looking back on the stress that I put myself in high school by not doing homework and stuff and being bad at high school, not interested, it just doesn't even matter, right? Now that I'm approaching things like as somebody who's interested in learning and wanting to learn a thing, it's way better that way. And if I can provide that for my kids, I want to do that. But it is a real thing. I don't even know. I didn't even occur to me that I was having this prideful moment until a teacher was like, just it's okay to slow it down.
totally.
And
Well,
so I
I was saying earlier, like I did an extra year of preschool basically, where I could either go to kindergarten or stay in preschool,
mhm,
right? And like I'm sure same types of pressures, right? Where it's like, oh, you're gonna hold, and I am certain that that is what made, it made school really easy. Like I think I was sort of like ahead then. Like I only one other time, actually two other times in my life, like I repeated algebra from seventh and eighth grade, and then I repeated business law in community college before transferring to San Francisco State. Both times, the first time it was immensely difficult, and then the second time it was immeasurably easy.
yeah, oh,
Like, and,
interesting,
I
yeah,
mean, it was like crazy to see it the second time, and I
mhm,
think the same probably applied for like my kindergarten experience, where kindergarten was relatively easy, first grade, second grade, and I think what that did for me was it put me, it put you in this place of being performant among your peers, being able to do things, and I bet that did more for my personal growth than trying to challenge me forward to be like the young, I was like the older, taller kid, so to
yeah,
speak, a lot of the time. um I don't know, it's
just
interesting, it's very interesting, because I think what it comes down to is you want to, it's very desirable to do what sound it's like what makes things easier, like having a higher performance on paper, I guess, can look better, but I think like eventually, the best people come from like learning to handle challenge. And maybe it's about kind of timing, like where in someone's life do they learn to sort of face things, and when are people maybe ready for sort of what next
right,
hurdles, versus like how do I stack up on the on the gate test or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. There's a story about this in I can't remember which. It's one of Malcolm Gladwell's books. It might be Outliers, about hockey players in Canada who outperform all the other kids. They're all born in a certain age range,
Yeah.
or like certain days of the month
Months.
in January. And I just remember this because, Wayne Gretzky's birthday is January 26th, same as my sister. That's why I remember. And within that 10-day range, these kids are dominant, and it's because they are older than everybody else in their age group, but they're still make the cut, right, without being unfair. So I wonder if that plays into it. And I think I've made my decision now. If we do go with this Waldorf school, it does make sense to me to just have them, why not repeat because he loved it. We were there, and he's just like, they make bread.
Yeah.
They're outside playing. They go for walks. They talk. They use, very high level language for his age group. Right. Cool. And you meet some of the older kids, and they're very smart, articulate, know what they want to do. Very, it's just different than, from the common child. So anyway, I'm chatting with Kellen Casebeer, founder of the Deal Lab. Thank you for joining me, man.
It's great to be here. Appreciate it. Happy Sunday. This is great. This is a good little Sunday one.
Sundays are, very chill.
Yep.
The boys are napping.
There you go.
How would you, so I'm going to actually jump into these like form questions. Just because I'm curious, and if you were to summarize your business philosophy in one sentence, or more than one sentence, that's okay. How would you describe that?
Are you saying like essentially like what the Deal Lab is?
Sure. Yeah. Let's start with there.
I would say that the philosophy, I'm going to use more than one sentence.
Great.
Okay. So I would say the philosophy is that there's a lot of companies that are going to spend money on doing outbound direct selling, right? So like that's a truth in the marketplace. And my belief, I used to be like a embedded outbound sales consultant where I would take those companies and I'd help them build out this big outbound sales program. So it'd be like technology and process and metrics and hiring, positioning, messaging, all that stuff, right? And what I saw was like there's this make or break. What makes or breaks outbound is like, can you generate pipeline, right? Like if you can generate pipeline, you'll be able to figure out the closing end of it. And so it's sort of like, can you get people interested in coming and talk to you? And what I saw was there was these people that were spending a bunch of money to very aggressively go attack what I would call sort of trying to force these meetings to happen. And there were times where we'd sort of have like we'd be in this bloated situation where there were ideas of things that we needed to test and validate to figure out what might work in these situations. And we were executing it through relatively junior sales reps. In this consulting engagement, we only had so much time with each client. Everyone had different kind of tech stacks. And if you're going 0 to 1, like inside of a company, you don't have the craziest, coolest tech stack. You have like a bare bones tech stack, right? And so what I saw was like the job to be done was figure out how to resonate with these markets in the context of what a client does. And I believed and I saw that the way we were going about doing that raised the price a lot more than it needed to. And it would sort of shorten how long people were willing to spend running those experiments and tests before they had something had to happen. Right. And so it's sort of like all the chips on the table, this better go really quick or it's going to really explode. And I didn't like the times when it exploded. So I was basically like, how can I build a business that can run higher quality tests, more of them each month at a higher rate of learning. And when I sort of posed that question to myself, I was like, it'll have to be, my process, my technology stack, me or my team actually operating it, so that what we can do is we can plug companies into us. We can segment the market really, really granularly. So we go market level segments of those markets, personas in the segments of the markets, and then angles to the personas of the segments of the markets. You map all of that out, and then basically each month we run, a handful of those as sequences where we'll sort of test and either validate or invalidate different angles to different personas and different segments of different markets, right? And so the general philosophy is like de-risk investment in outbound by testing and validating message market fit before you sort of scale outbound, whatever that looks like in the context of different companies.
Awesome. There's only one other person that I know who has approached outbound to as a like a form of testing, at least to begin with. And I think maybe some people do it without knowing that they're doing it. They're still, the goal is still something else. And that's Evan Dunn. And that this idea in talking to you and talking with Evan about this has so profoundly changed how I talk to people and my expectations for when I'm on the phone with somebody. I mean, how did you, I guess you kind of explained it, but I mean, was there an instance where you were like, we are like just not doing the right thing? Did something happen? Is there a story, like a story behind that?
A little bit, a little bit. So basically what happened is like I was in this delivery seat, right, where people were paying us, like they were paying like our company 20 grand a month, and then they had a tech stack and they had a rep. So like let's say this is like a 30 grand per month situation. And so and what would happen is like we wouldn't actually be doing the outbound until let's say halfway through this like 6 month project. So people would be like, they would have invested 100, something plus $1,000 before we're even like starting to figure out if the situation works, right? And so
Wow.
if we would show up and it would immediately be working, like it would go great, because it was sort of like there's a lot of anticipation and excitement, and there was a lot of stuff, like we were doing great work. It wasn't like BS at all. It was just clear that like it was predicated on sort of high spend, very like aggressive, the way I put it is like all the chips on the table, all in bet on the situation. Sometimes that's fine, right? And 2/3 of the time, like we nailed it. But so what would happen is showing up to these like weekly calls, right, with these clients. Sometimes, so if you think of that thing of like pretend you had it all mapped out so clearly. At the time we didn't exactly, but essentially like week over week, the job was define an audience, like run some sort of something against them, whether it's emails or calls or social or both or whatever. And then the next week be like, all right, how'd it go? What happened? Right. And so so when we would do these check-ins, the founders sometimes would be like, what's going on? What are you guys doing? And be like, well, we segmented it this way, we did this, and like this is what we're seeing. And sometimes they would be like, well, I would start to get the objection of like, didn't we already try that? Right. And they tell me, didn't we already try to segment the market? And it's like, this isn't like a try. Like this is and so what happened was I'd be in these situations where I knew that the job to be done, like, you give me $1 billion to be right about what we should be doing in the situation. It was like, we need to granularly define audiences and test things and figure out where we can and cannot resonate. Right. And you don't just necessarily endlessly do that. And like, I don't know, someone listening might be like, oh, like run paid ads, I don't know. Sure. There's other ways, but in the, these people had already invested in. So it's sort of like in the bounds of the thing that I was, hired to deliver against, the job to be done was like, keep running the tests, right? And keep and asking, and we'd be talking about like, is there something else we can offer to these people? Looking back at like old client, so we're doing all this stuff, but I basically needed a way to sort of justify and like physically demonstrate progress. Because what I realized is, to these people, I'm saying we're going to do like kind of like, run the slot machine. I was like, no. Like there actually is this kind of concept somewhat of traction, or at least of like progression. And I needed to better articulate like, why does such nuance exist? Like why, why does this feel like this like crazy, like nebulous concept, right? That we're just sort of like perennially chasing. And so I was like, okay, well, first let me break down like what is like, we talk about the market and we talk about the different people we can sell to. I'm a big fan of like Justin Michaels, like CEO of the problem concept, and his like route rule multiply script, right? And so it's sort of like, okay, so there's like these markets we serve, but if you think of any given market, if you're just go a layer further and segment it so that you have like deeper specificity than what everyone else is doing, it changes how you can communicate to them, right? And then if you think of this persona, who the CEO of the problem is inside of this more granular thing, not only do you have like, oh, what the VP of sales is, but if like VP sales of, 400% year over year growth, crypto startup without a CM, like whatever, there starts to be this like story that's happening, right? But there can be a lot of these personas and there's a lot of these segments. And then the next level is like what I call angle, which is a way of decoupling from pain point, which is like, if people might talk about a pain point as sort of this static idea. And so it's sort of like, hey, we can talk about a pain point a lot of different ways. So there's all these different angles, so it's sort of just a way that we could paint this picture, like lots of variability. And that week over week, I could literally cross off things that we ran that didn't work and circle things that were like a little bit better. Be like, based on this, we're going to do this. Based on this, we're going to do this. You know, so that was sort of like where this general concept came from. It was a little long-winded, but hopefully.
No, that's cool. That's totally good. I mean, it's I almost don't want to talk about it because it feels like it feels like a big enough problem where we could just kind of corner the market by just using this idea of testing. Sure. But I mean, it's a huge problem because the expectation, it sounds like the expectation going in is like, oh, you know what to do and who to target. You just need to do the work and then we'll start getting results, when really it's like, I mean, yes, to some degree, but we have this hypothesis that these are the people that should be targeted, but we need to test that out and actually find out if that's true. Then if that is true, we can double down on that and really run. And that's where it's that little thing that that idea has been game changing for me.
I think it's like the transfer of risk is the way I see it, right? Because face value, like done for you outbound work of whether it's emails, calls, or whatever, is like, we want to generate more sales opportunities. Will you do that work for us? Right? And so the presumption is that it will work. Right. But what people don't talk about is if you're doing the sales development work, you can do the right things and it can be non-performant. Right. So it's like you can build the right list, validate it the right way, spend the right amount of hours calling the right people, sending the right emails. You can do everything perfect the right way and it cannot work. Right. And so the demand of the marketplace is like to skip how something becomes performant. And they're just like, we just want the performance. But if they haven't done anything before, if it hasn't been done before, then no one knows. No one really knows, right? Now, there's some assumptions and presumptions, right? There's some places, right, that maybe know because they have databases of who will and won't take meetings, but then that's not actually mapping as like transferable against the market. That's just like kind of gamifying like the interpretation of results.
Yeah.
Right. So there's some like big lead gen companies that will have in their database, they'll know who will take this stuff. And so, you know, your month one, you're like, all right, we're always going to book 8 against this. And they can literally guarantee results. But if you think of the people that are most likely to take every fucking meeting, sorry, but like those are not the people that are going to go buy your stuff. Like it just means that, you know, it's sort of like you're behaviorally hacking the willingness to show up to something. So anyways, yeah, just that.
That's awesome. I wonder, like, so going back to the education thing, I wonder how much of a connection between this. It seems it's not counterintuitive to think that way. You're just, I can picture myself just being like, we need to deliver something to them because they're paying us a ton of money.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe in the moment you felt like you didn't have a lot to show for it, but you did though. It's not what they were expecting. Like
part of it too, when I built my business, the thing I saw was like lower the spend to test things and sort of zero in on like message validation, message market fit, right? When I started my business though, and was like, how do I help people find message market fit? And I was sort of like, okay, I'm going to do a done for you service so that we'll kind of just do the work to make it easier to acquire. I also realized that meant inherently that we would have people that pay us to do things that we're not going to get the outcomes they wanted, right? Yeah. Like that is just one, you know, if you do outbound work, if you do sales work, it's almost definite that like at some point someone's going to give you money for something that you're not going to end up being able to perform against, right? And so because of that, I was like, okay. And I also believed that I have more to lose in ruining my reputation than gain in like the nth next deal. You know, I'm not doing like $10 million deals that makes it like really like desirable to maybe like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, there's not some crazy pressure to be unethical. It's like, no. Like I need to be very careful not to ruin like this little good thing I got going on. And so I basically built the whole process, like the experience of like our statement of work, you know, like what we actually do for people through the lens of what is the right process to get them the right outcome. And then what would I have to have the experience look like to make it so someone who gets no positive outcome would still look at the time we spent together and feel like it was money well spent, right? And so if you sort of like tailor the experience to go like even the person who doesn't actually get the sales outcomes they want would look at the entirety of the thing and be like, I learned and I got a lot of value out of this and I feel really comfortable and confident about what happened and whatever. Like I knew if that person could walk away and be like, I'm glad I did this, then, you know, making people perform is just like icing on the cake. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so, you know, sort of like my day one goal was like how to make it so someone could sort of fail through a pilot period and not walk away being like, I feel like I got scammed. That sucked. And, you know, so
Hmm.
far I've been really proud. It's funny because I've had people who work for us who've worked at other places and they've been like, wow, you guys have a very different relationship with your
Yeah.
clients. It's like, and then we get to sell that way too, right? Because then on the sales side, it's just telling people like, hey, look, this is what it is. Like, if you haven't done this before, I didn't choose your market. I didn't choose what you do for them. I can build the bridge between them and I can operate the feedback loop. If we find out that that doesn't work, like it is what it is. And if you haven't ran this before, I can't guarantee that that's not a potential outcome. It's just nothing. And so if it's not worth it for you to spend this money to learn whether or not this works, including it might not work, then you shouldn't give me a single dollar because that's absolutely a possible outcome of spending money to test and validate this stuff.
Right.
Like that's an acceptable, you know, when you run an experiment, like outcomes are outcomes, you know, like it's not like, you know, oh, I want to see what happens, but I really want it to be this and I'm going to do everything. It's like, that's not how it works. You
Yeah.
know?
You're asking your
Right.
market something, they could very well say no to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a lot of people in the space that'll promise the world, that'll, you know, all this stuff. And so it's super funny because there's times that like I'll be in a sales call where someone's like, I can tell they really like what I'm saying. And I know that they're being told by other people, like, we guarantee that. And I'll be like, I can't do that. And they're like, I know you can't guarantee, but like, what would you, I'm like, I'm not going to do this to you. And
Yeah.
you can almost just tell that like people buy, there's such extreme demand from buyers to sell in certain ways that is not really the highest level of like ethical, basically. You know what I mean? Like buyers try to force you to offer things and promise things and do all this kind of stuff that like really we should be going like, no, 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 like you're only allowed to buy if you understand that that's not present in the situation. Like don't try to, you know, make me whether literally hedge or even like, you know, sometimes people almost want you to say something that's going to make them feel better where it doesn't change the actual transaction, but maybe it will help them feel like, oh, well, you know, well, do you think
Hmm.
it's going to work? It's like, look, you need to say yes to this only if you can hear me saying, I have no idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Wow. That
It's
is
good. You
very,
get great clients out of this. You know, you get the right clients. The clients you get, they're awesome. And I just tell people, like, if what I just said sounds exciting, if you would love the experience of what I just described, you'll love working together. And what I'll say is, and if you heard all of this and you're like, man, this Kellen guy really knows his stuff, I'm pretty sure it's definitely going to work. And so maybe I want to work with him. I'm like, don't do it.
yeah.
You
Wow.
know?
That is like a free game. That's like the definition of being able to walk away, not because you should walk away,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to, I feel like that even that statement is couched in like some kind of bravado, like I'm just going to walk away because this person is, you know, I don't want to work with this person. But more so, there's a real chance that I can't do what you're expecting, and if you're expecting a guarantee,
I tell him, like, I
I'm
don't
not
want
the
you to
guy.
hate me. You know, again, like, I
Yeah,
don't want to
yeah.
mess up my reputation. I'm not trying to have a bunch of people out there. You know, I'm not like, I
Hmm.
don't, you can't get rich off a client. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
you can't, like, there's no, you know, and so, yeah. I
but
just think like long game is so everything. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And I just see so many people so thirsty for like the next client, the next, you know, people are so eager about what they get out of things.
Hmm.
You know, it's like it's just the classic Josh Brown like deposits withdrawals, you know, and it's
Hmm.
like forcing yourself to always be over deposited, under withdraw, and like even you know, yeah, just that.
That's really good. Is there so? There's another question that I have like written down. Is there like a business trend that you are skeptical of? Like that idea of playing the long game, we all know is true. Like you should play the long game,
Yeah,
but it's still easy to be like, this month I'm going to do X and it's going to make me
yeah,
this much money. Whereas if you look at, well, this year, if I do these things, I can set myself up for the next year, right? Thinking in terms of years instead of days. Is there something you see generally people doing? You're like, I don't think that's going to work.
y- yes. I think so. There's two answers come to mind, right? The first one is like the strongest one is just via negativa, right? Which is like the ancient Stoic saying of like addition by subtraction, right? So
Hmm.
I think the first biggest pitfall. It's so my friend Nick Abraham, he runs an awesome lead gen agency, and he always posts about like anyone who just sticks with something over time, like basically almost always makes it work. You know, like you don't find someone who committed to one single thing for 3 years and didn't make it work. You know, and this mostly applies to sort of like known industries, maybe we'll say, right? Like true innovation, like, you know, like left field, like SpaceX innovation. I don't know. I have no context, but I can't. But so I think the first thing is just like, like, oh man, I could go on about this all day. I like this. Okay, so the Via Negativa thing, part of it is that like, I think so. If you think of like, okay, how could one get success? Most people could name paths that are somewhat sure to success, right? It's like go to law school, study really hard the whole time, be extremely hardworking. You'll probably turn out great. But like, why don't people do that? Because there's a lot of barriers in the way, right? And so what happens is everyone's looking to avoid the barriers, and you just can't. It will not work. Like this was me. Like this was me before I did what I'm doing now. Is like I always wanted to be, you know, doing my own business or something. You know, I had this like notion of like wanting to do something, and it wasn't until I just was like, and what I realized was like I was scared to like lose a wage. I was scared to walk away from these things that made me comfortable, but it was sort of like that was holding me back, you know. And I think that like rather than being scared of this unknown, this difficult thing, just being like it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very stressful. It's going to, you know, and the people that are willing to walk a straight path straight through that challenge and those challenges over time, like that's who succeeds. Like that's who does the best, you know what I mean? And so you'll just see like people opt out, you know. It's not about opting in. It's like don't decide to do the next thing, you know. And it's okay if you do also, right? So like I don't think it's like just choose one thing and like never ever question it again. But I do think it's kind of like, because people think like success is like this one attribute, but like people's lives are made up of lots of different things that they care about. And so sometimes it's like there's a clear path to success in a professional endeavor, and people aren't pursuing it because they actually care a lot more about other things that aren't work that is incompatible with that path. Right. And so to me, I always say like your behaviors are most indicative of what you care most about. And so if you have a hard time focusing on what you're doing, I think you need to like question what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And if the answer goes back to like this is the right path, you kind of just need to like suck it up and make it happen, because that is what success looks like, is like continue through this, you know, don't do it alone, talk to people, you know, there's some of that type of stuff. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part is Lindy, right? And I'm gonna hit up like I really think this is an underrated concept. And so, you're familiar with Paul Scalise, my friend,
Yes.
who's an amazing writer. And so the concept of Lindy is basically like things that have existed, have survived through time, are more likely to continue to survive through time, right? And the more recent something is, the less likely it is to kind of continue, right? So like drinking coffee is Lindy. People have drank coffee forever, so it's highly unlikely that like the mushroom teas are going to replace coffee, right? And in fact, if you were to look over history, lots of things have come up as potential coffee replacements and gone away. Coffee persists.
Right.
Right. And so the lesson here, in my opinion, is, and so Paul writes about Lindy, you know, in a lot of different ways. But I think the most profound thing to take from it is like, there are ways people have spent time, and there are things people have spent energy and effort solving for or addressing since the beginning of man that have been worthwhile pursuits. Right. And so to me, so if something's Lindy, it's like it is. You know, if something has existed through time, it's likely because there's some sort of like overarching value or validity to it, right? And so it's almost like you can trust in these things more. And so I think understanding like what are the common threads through the trends is a way to anchor yourself to something that is less volatile to moving, right? And so it's like I mean, you know, as an example, I'm a clay partner. I'm like, you know, people call these clay agencies. I don't use that name, and like I'm not over attached to clay because clay is new. And what clay is doing right now is sort of like an arbitrage of opportunity, but eventually it'll probably be sort of like parity. The thing that's like the Lindy thread is being like a creative, you know, like a creative person, and, you know, willing to learn the technologies and tools and things like that. And if you think of like over time, are AI going to replace XYZ, whatever? you can always look at every single point in history, and there's been businesses and there have been people that help those businesses find and acquire and do transactions with customers. And the people that have doing that have been outgoing. They've been, maybe let's say charming or whatever, whatever nice things we want to say about ourselves. But the point is that it's sort of like the Lindy thread. Now, has it always been cold email? Has it always been cold calling? No, right? It used to be standing around in the square. It used to be, whatever. And so I think tying your skill sets and the things you spend your time to things that have sort of historical proof of being value, and then casting those into the future is like a huge opportunity, especially if there's an arbitrage where something has existed in a certain way and then it doesn't really exist for a more modern, like trendy situation. Right. And so like what I do is like, helping people identify markets and outreach to customers. It's always been there, always will be. Right now I use like the current day tech stack, the current tool stack, in fact, not even just technology, for a market that I understand really well and that has money flowing through it. But if software went away tomorrow, I could take the same meta concepts and I could go, help my local doctor get more customers or something.
Awesome. Yeah, this is kind of not, I have random thoughts, so forgive me, but it's sort of related. I have this, I like the arts. I like reading. I like books, movies, music, all the stuff. And I have this kind of boomerish hot take that the art now is just so bad. I mean, I think we accept certain things, and it doesn't mean I don't enjoy a lot of the, quote unquote bad art. But there's these old ideas that have been around for so long that I just think get forgotten. They're just forgotten. And we think we're saying something profound because we heard something new, right? It's new.
Yeah.
So then it's profound, and then we think we're smart, and it's like, oh, well, there's something, this idea, whatever it happens to be, has been around for millennia.
It's Lindy. That is a very Lindy, right? And like, yeah, it's part of why that Lindy wisdom is so valuable, right? Is knowing it's not just what has been worthwhile, but sort of like, because it also helps address like what problems have always existed and thus likely will always continue to exist that maybe we just can't solve for. There's a lot of people who, inside of themselves experience turmoil because of like situations or whatnot. That's sort of like, no, like you just need to accept like that's table stakes. It's like how you get to show up.
Yes, exactly. Actually, there's again another random thought. In the Bible, I'm bringing up the Bible, right? So not to preach or anything like that, but there's just there's funny stories, and like there's a story of Abraham early on where he couldn't have a kid. He's 99 years old or something, and he and his wife can't have a child, and his wife is just like, well, why don't you just sleep with the maid then, basically? And he's like, really? I can do that? and he does it, right? And I just am thinking about that story because there's just ways in which I see people behave now, or I myself, right? Not to even judge anybody else. Not that I'm like, sleeping with a maid or anything. It just is, yeah, sorry, it's a random thought, but just this idea of Lindy, I've been actually trying to understand what it meant. I always just thought of it as like a funny joke, like with the 4-hour life and the, you can really feel the pull of the weekend, and wow, washing cars with buckets, you don't see that much, stuff like that. I always just thought of it as funny, but I didn't understand that through line of what it meant. So thank you for explaining that.
It actually came from like Taleb's book Anti-Fragile. Like there's a mathematical equation that is the Lindy quotient.
Okay.
And so it's like a literal probability equation of like persisted existence predicated on historical existence. And so it's like but yeah, it ends up sort of extrapolating further once you get into all the lore. The 4HL is a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. It makes me laugh. So how do you know him? How do you know Paul Scalise? Do you guys like grow up together, or is it just like just online, being in the same communities?
Yeah. COVID era,
Okay.
Yeah, like I think slightly before COVID even, but like I initially, basically what happened is I used to just have like a random like anonymous like Twitter account that I didn't post from, that I would just sort of use to like follow various things, world news and like soccer teams, stuff like that.
Hmm.
And one of I saw someone like there's like a meme account that was like like a tech CEO meme account that was
Hmm.
like replying to someone I followed, and it was being like really funny, and I remember clicking on it, just being like, oh, for some reason it was like this. I was like, oh, that's funny that like kind of like these people aren't just like hardos and like, oh, this guy's being funny. And so like I followed this account, and that account was sort of in what is known as the Lindy table, which is
Hmm.
like the sphere around Paul Scalise, right? And so yeah, and so it's just sort of like a bunch of people that were like kind of participating in this like common sphere, and then just like, you know, multiply that over years. And
Yeah.
we bonded over like jujitsu. You know, he used to train
Mm.
at, like Henzo Gracie's gym in New York, which is like a super famous gym. A bunch of like the top guys come from.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry for context. If you're not on Twitter, X, Lindy Man is Paul Scalise. Paul Scalise is Lindy Man, and he has a lot of interesting contributions. Actually, I was reading his like Beehive newsletter, and just quirky, funny takes on things like there was one called the Autumn Olympics.
Yeah.
That there should be an Olympics in autumn rather than summer and winter. I love that sort of thing, and just that we mentioned angles before, like just looking at life with from a different perspective, like what's it called, a parallax view. Have you heard of that before?
I've heard the name, but not.
If someone's driving a car and you see the speed limit and it says 60 for the driver, but the person is looking at the same thing, it might look like they're going 70 or 80 only because they're looking at it from a different angle.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think he's kind of like artistic too. Like the way I see it is like, it's like artistic philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to see people like write from that, where it's not necessarily like just created to be like an easily simply digestible, you know, it's not like SEOified or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of all this, I should thank you because we kind of met online as well, mutual, you know, LinkedIn friends and whatever else. And we had a conversation that I thought went really well. And you encouraged me to start creating, because I asked my friends this question: what do you view my unique expertise? Like when you see me, is there something that you see in me that I'm not seeing for myself that maybe I do really well? And when it comes to this parallax view, I remember you looking at me like, I think you're asking the wrong question, man. Like you just need to start creating. And this is kind of the birth of this podcast, doing the Rizz Dev newsletter, which has been great. Like as I've started creating, this new network has appeared like out of thin air. People asking me, people wanting to speak to me now. Like I'm getting DMs from people. This is interesting. What are you working on? So I want to thank you for that. Do you consider yourself to be an artist, or have you just always been a creative
First of all, you're
type?
welcome. I would say, yeah. I mean, I definitely would. I'm very into music. You know, I'm a very musical person. I'm not particularly good at art. You know what I mean? It's one of the things I love about it though, is like I was a skateboarder, you know, so I was like
Mm-hmm.
a very like DIY punk rock type of, you know, Tony Hawk Pro Skater sort of youth experience. And
Nice.
so yeah, I was always into music. Like I would just say for sure. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to me it's sort of like, I guess part of the like meta, you know, I don't know, like for me would be, it's sort of like, I think a lot of people take life very seriously, where it's sort of like, it's really important what I'm trying to achieve. It's really important that I like take the right step, blah, 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 you know, all these types of things. And this is almost like it's a little bit Tim Ferriss influence, right? Like in what's it called? The 4 Hour Work Week. He talks about this concept of like deferred happiness, where he's like, most people live their life like, I'm doing what I'm doing now because eventually something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of like, I reject so for him, it's like, I reject that. So I'm going to automate a business and be rich, right? And it's, you know, I'm going to invest in Twitter early on or something like,
Right.
but I think, you know, to go back to like Lindy Man, Paul Scalise, like for me, what that meant is sort of like, make sure you spend some of your time investing in worthwhile activities. And it's so, and Tim Ferriss, actually, he interviewed, what's that guy's, Ramit Sethi, and he talked about like this idea of your rich life, right? And like Ramit Sethi was like, you know, so if you think about like, if you're a billionaire, like let's say you have infinite money, You know, because people have this idea of like I'm not doing what I want now because I'm waiting until basically until I have a bunch of money, right? Like that's kind of like the general meta concept is like once I have more money. And he's like, and if you think about that and you go, you know, what would your life actually be like? He's like, you only like you can only, you know, you have the same 24 hours. Like, you know, you spend some time sleeping, you know, you a lot of the stuff ends up looking the same. And he basically says like most people's relationship to their expenditures is sort of about like like sort of like fearful spending, like trying to like spend less, like don't, you know, save, like they're trying to, you know, not get the food they want, you know. And it's sort of again like limit the current life to like eventually get what you want. And he's like, in your rich life though, if you think about it, he goes, a lot of these things don't actually cost more money, you know. So he gives the example of like, he's like, I thought in my rich life I would never stay on the second floor of a hotel and never across from an ice machine. He's like, it ends up you just call ahead and they'll just do that for you, right? And so the concept is sort of like, how are we like spiritually suppressing ourselves by our perception of like we don't deserve what we want yet, you know? And so I think, so to me, if I think of like how I want to act and exist, a lot of people have this like scarcity where it's like I'm trying to be overly it's like the kid playing soccer, right? They're trying to be in the perfect position at the perfect time because they want to have the perfect outcome, and it's like very controlled, it's very stressful, right? And like to me that stress, like I have a mantra that's like artificial stress is hell. Like my definition of hell is to feel a constraint, to feel like you are bound by something that you're not actually bound by. And most people are living mostly under that. Like most decisions are like fear based, pressure based, sort of whatever. And so to me, it's somewhat of like a act of rebellion against that to exist in a little bit more of like a you know, you could call it eccentric, you could call it whimsical, funsy, but like so there's this little bit of this like so, and I consider it musical. It's funny that you like ask this because I literally do consider it like if you because if you think of like a good song, it's not necessarily the structure of the music, it's not like it's not the guitar that was played, it's not like even the guy playing it, you know. A lot of music gets better when it's worse, you know. Like there's this thing, and to me like that is like the spice of life is like being tuned into like that type of thing because it frees you from some of these other pressures and stressors and stuff. And so I tell people like I want all the same stuff, you know. I'm like I'm a very you know I'm like a I aspire to be and would consider myself like a high performer. You know, I work very hard. You know, I you know, intense, right? All these things, but I think it's a little bit anchored to this more like musical, artistic, you know, experience of life, right? Like I, you know, and it's a balance, right? My dad was a small business owner. My parents were deadheads, right? So this is like the deadhead side of me.
That's awesome. Yeah, when I think about there's all these different characterizations of teams, and people say family or a professional sports team. Um, but I feel like the now, especially the way business is going, at least in terms of SaaS and, you know, these founders and startups, it's more like a group of musicians getting together.
Yeah.
Where, because people who don't know the same language but play instruments can actually communicate with one another using just musical terms, right? I'm playing, you know, we're playing a 2-5-1 in the key of G. This is the tempo. It's a, you know, maybe it's more of a samba type, you know, you can talk like that, and everybody can come together musically and play a song as with the sheet music as the roadmap, this idea, you know, the key that they're in, and then boom, you're out. Like that's what professional musicians do. They show up and play on albums. Like actually what's a really cool little documentary, I love Steely Dan. It's probably my favorite band.
Cool. Yeah. Oh,
and
awesome.
Because it's like it's one of the only, like they're the only group that did it's really hard to define what they're playing. Like these guys like rock, but they're so into the melody that they play all these different things that, like, you listen to like Kid Charlemagne, famously sampled by Kanye West, Champion, check it out. Kid Charlemagne has like what's considered the best guitar solo ever, but Steely Dan anyway is just two guys. The rest of the team is a bunch of professional studio musicians who are at the top of their game in the 70s. And that's what business seems to me like now, especially for what we're doing when it comes to the future of like these SaaS companies. Like there's all this talk about, you know, how much experience someone has, or like, you know, being an SDR. Sean. Okay, so Sean Cease. I don't know if you know who he is,
Yeah.
but I saw him leave a comment about people to hire for the role of SDR. Is it's better to hire somebody in their middle age because they actually can stick to doing the work, and they don't, they don't get, it's like some Gen Xer is not going to get flustered about being hung up on,
Yep.
right? So somebody who's 45 years old plus would be great at being an SDR because they're going to show up, right? And so, um, anyway, I'm kind of trailing
Well,
off.
what one of the things that comes to mind is like, and I have like I think that's a flavor of company is the way I would put
Mhm.
it. I think that so I worked for someone who used this model called EOS in their business, which is like
Mhm.
entrepreneur operating system, and it's like a book and it's a consulting business system, but it's like an operations system where people will hire these people to like help them implement the methodology,
Mhm.
right? And EOS has an order for how companies sort of orient like what they care about, right? And at the top of it is core values.
Mhm.
So like EOS says like the number one thing that happens in a company is core values. And then under that you have your goals, under that you have strategy, some of these like strategy, your org chart, some of these other things. But it's like everything comes down to core values. And to me what that means is like alignment to purpose. And I
Mhm.
think purpose is subjective, right? And so to go back to like you use steel, it's funny. It's funny that to me in a way that you're using like Steely Dan because you're like, okay, there's these two guys, they care about this. You even use like professional musicians in this. But like I think so there's a coffee shop in downtown Walnut Creek that on Saturdays just anyone shows up and they just sit there and jam. No sheet music, no talking, but it's just kind of like if you show up and make sounds with us, like cool. And you go in on a Saturday and I'm not kidding you, 20 people, any type of instrument, who knows what, playing who knows what. Some are great, some are terrible. But and to me it's like, and when those people are sitting there, like think of the good music, the great musicians sitting there, they're not bothered that the guy hitting the maracas like off time, right? They're having a great time because the purpose that they're showing up for is a little bit different. And I think that when I think of company, I think this is something that it's like an attribute that just literally doesn't exist in most people's brain, that is like so underrated, is like what is the purpose of the situation, right? So you see SDRs sometimes who are frustrated about churn inside of a company,
Mhm.
but a company might be hiring an SDR because the situation is the same thing I sell into, which is like we're trying to figure out if this can work or not. We don't know. A company can't just pay someone in perpetuity forever if something doesn't work,
Right. Right.
right? But sometimes I think it's on the, and then the SDR doesn't necessarily see or feel, or maybe the company doesn't make it clear oftentimes just how volatile the situation is. And so what happens is there's like this bitterness because the core values weren't aligned, right? There's some reps out there that would totally raise their hand and be like, oh, you only got 90 days to fund this, and or it blows up. Like, dream situation, sign me up. You know what I mean? Like that exists. But what happens is people try to be too like much of a monoculture, so to speak. They try to sort of appease the caricature of the other side of the equation that they don't even like, right? So like the reps interview, like they're trying to interview for the boss they hate. Companies advertise for jobs like they're trying to hire the average SDR, which is not going to help them succeed, right? And instead, people I think should be more clear of like what is the purpose, what is sort of like this aligned core value potential fit, because for me, like I would, so like take Jason Lemkin. Jason Lemkin is what Jason Lemkin's Steely Dan. Like it's like he's laying off the underperformer, and I love he's crazy high performance, right? Like he's Jason Lemkin, and there are people out there, and it's like if you're hiring him, right? Like you're not hiring him, there's certain companies that aren't going to go hire Jason Lemkin and do what he says, right? Like they wouldn't want to, right? There's founders out there. Some founders are like, maybe that's like the cold hard business lens on the situation. But I actually, maybe people would call it like care about my people. I don't think he doesn't care about his people. He just has a lens on what that means,
Right.
right? And for someone else, it might mean like I've seen lots of companies, they won't say it, but a lot of companies are like, we're just going to pay the people that we have, and because we like them until we crash and burn, because what we're doing right now ain't working. But we're not going to say that. We're gonna we're just going to write it out. So yeah, I think that there's stuff like that. I'm like a Grateful Dead guy, where it's like I don't want to do the same thing twice the
Mhm.
same way. I want to have a little bit of a jam band going on. but still rooted in some like extreme technicality and precision and stuff like that.
Nice. I am relatively new to the Grateful Dead,
Yeah.
and if somebody, what would you recommend? Where should I start? There's a deep catalog.
Yeah. So the like real answer is like Summer 72 European tour.
Okay.
Live shows only I would recommend. Like, so the Grateful Dead, the whole thing about the Grateful Dead is they don't do their live show. It's like the lore. If you go listen to like the recorded catalog, you're just like not like that's like a other thing, So like
Okay.
so to me, like Grateful Dead has like Sirius XM Grateful Dead station. If you turn that thing on for like a week straight, that's the Grateful Dead.
Okay.
Like, wait, there are periods of this that suck. It's like, yeah, exactly. There's times that like they play real slow and they're, there's like this long, anyways, there's lore to it. But if you do the European tour 72, or if you do the Portland, I think it's also 72 Oregon show, they did like Sunshine Daydream is like the name of the show after the fact, so to speak.
Yeah.
But those are good. You could also look at Live at the Altamont Pass, which is like up near me. I don't know. Are you familiar with this story at all?
No.
So they played a show with the Rolling Stones at Altamont Pass. They made it free, and then they didn't have security, so they hired the Hells Angels, and like someone ended up getting like stabbed to death at the show. So it's like a sad, tragic thing. But
Yeah.
it's a piece of the lore.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've talked about this a few other times with a few other people. I grew up like, very conservative Christian school, church, Baptist. And I started playing guitar when I was 15. But originally I wanted to play the bass, but my mom was like, no, we don't play bass. And we really didn't. It was just like a piano and organ type of church, which ultimately led me down this path of having a deep interest in art because like I just didn't understand like how could a sound be bad, right? I think we're probably attributing something weird to this, but the Grateful Dead was like these are demon possessed musicians on stage. Have you heard this before?
No, but so my mom grew up like a Catholic, going to like Catholic school, and I'm sure that it's I think that was exactly like probably her her experience like meeting my dad and hanging out with my dad was probably like hold on.
Yeah, look, and if this is you and you're listening to this, whoever few people are listening, cool. This is not a judgment, but I will say like this is you're seeding the ground for deep interest. You're kind of doing the opposite of what you think you're doing, right? So, and I'm grateful for it. I wouldn't change anything about, and I get it. Like my parents are just, they're from the Dominican Republic. It's mostly my mom. My dad was totally like, you just.
Jerry Garcia looked pretty crazy. Like I get it.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, it's
they weren't totally wrong.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
but
like
still,
my parents got it's funny because like my parents were deadheads, but they definitely. Not, if that's like a scale of like 1 to 11, they're like a nice 5.
Yeah.
They saw a lot of local shows. They didn't,
Well, there's this, okay. I like stories. I like fiction. I like reading nonfiction, right? And I realize people only have so much time in their life, especially if you own a business, like you might not have any time to read it all. Maybe you don't value it or TV shows or anything like that. But I just think that there's great value in even just fiction, right? You can read a story that happened to somebody that didn't exist and you're connecting with an author and you can still derive truth from it, right? So this is, again, a part of like the Rizz dev. I'm totally beating this stupid Rizz thing into the ground. It's rendered into like a silly dad joke at this point. But the idea of it is that to be more well-rounded is the missing skill set. Like stop with the tactics and techniques. Like people will totally be more interested, like even on the basis level of connecting with a stranger on the phone, they would be way more interested in talking with you if like they realize that they're talking to a human being, not responding to your script, right? And yeah, so I'm going to be listening to a lot of Grateful Dead this weekend.
Yeah, I had a professor in school. I had like So I went to community. So like and we'll give this out of context. I left high school as a 15-year-old. I went to community college for 5 years, and then I went to SF State for 2 years to finish my degree. And at SF State, I had a class where my professor had to go back home to like his home country because like his mother passed away or something,
Mhm.
and so he had to like leave in the middle of the semester. And so we inherited a professor who was an adjunct who happened to be like the coolest professor ever. Like he's really awesome. Um, and it's like your classic like he'd had like a cool private sector career and then decided he like wanted to like teach kids, and so he's teaching at SF State, and it's like he's like way overpowered for the job, super he's a super goofy, like very very eccentric guy, very prince, very like which was fun. It's fun to learn from a character a bit, right?
Right.
And so he tried to only shop with certified B Corp companies. He rode a motorcycle, which is like funny, because he's kind of like he's a little dorky, like he's dorky but cool, and so it's like like strong cool and very his teaching principle. He taught me a lot about like pattern interrupt and attention. So he would fluctuate tonality and loudness, and he would do things like suddenly swear in ways, and he would just tell us, he's like, this hacks your attention. And so he would
Mhm.
like, so it was just it felt like like when you see a concert, you can just tell it's like, oh, here's this person doing their song, and then you see a concert and you're like, yo, that person like went off and this is like a performance.
Right.
This felt like the first time I was having a professor that was like, yo, this dude's like really making this awesome for us, this is really cool.
Yeah.
In for not the first time like ever per se, but like for what it was like taking like marketing electives at like SF State. And so so anyways, one of his mantras, like one of the things he taught us was like, he's like, if you're a salesperson, you are first a student of culture, is what he would tell us. And he's like, because so much of the context of selling is like connecting with people and stuff. And he's like, so he's like, you need to be, he'd be like, you need to be able to walk into a bank and like, you hear them talking about like the new Porsche that dropped, and like you want to know what's going on with the brake lines and how they changed that. And he's like, and then
Mhm.
you walk into the other place and it's the mom and pop shop and they're talking about the town ordinances. Like you want to know what's going on, and like you want to know, you have the common connections and stuff. And he's like, it's not cool to be, and it, he wasn't taught. I'm really big on like positive, negative, and sort of like scarce abundance type language. But to me, what he was essentially saying is like, it's not cool just to be like a hard ass and like not care about anything. Like you need to have this certain like colorful character behind you, even to be that like sort of intense performer. It's like, it's just an advantage.
Right.
And so I totally agree with you that like it's a massive, it's like one of those like paradoxical things where it's sort of like counterintuitive to be like, these things are important, care about them, but then you do that really well and you find like, oh, actually this is in fact like hardcore business strategy, perform, all
Yeah.
that type of stuff. And I think it just depends on, to to me it's like a humanness quotient. And there's some people that like I don't think really like people, and then you meet people and you're like, oh, you really like people, like you like this, you're curious, you ask good questions, right? Like when we first talked, I was like, oh, this is, there's thoughtfulness behind this that inherently communicates a certain ethos, right? That is like much more than like, I work at Google or something like that.
Yeah. Going back to like bringing this into the workplace again with cold calling, I can't tell you the amount of times that somebody scheduled with me, not because I asked the right question, but because they seemed to just like the interaction.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of times where it was, I handled the objection and everything was good about the call, but more often than not, it seems like, the person laughed and then,
Yep.
Here's why. If it doesn't make sense, then don't schedule. That's fine. I'll send you some info or whatever. I can't even think of a specific, there's one specific time actually recently, although the guy, showed, so maybe that's not a good one, but he did. I made this joke like, hey, I'm just a lowly SDR, you're asking a very technical question, but that's why I'm calling. Let me connect you with so-and-so. And they said, well, you give yourself some more credit. We've been talking for like a few minutes here. And this was like a 10-minute cold call, right? Again, I for all of the, I understand that, LinkedIn rewards a certain kind of content. But these arguments about what to say and how to say it on the phone and when to say it and the tactics is all tired, because I've seen it all, where I've seen the person who only does permission based openers on the phone performs well. The person who doesn't and just jumps right in, they do well. It's like, are you doing the thing that works for you? Right. I just feel like there's too much thought that goes around it, where you've forgotten that, hey, you are calling somebody, you're interrupting what they're doing, and they want to make sure that if they're going to say yes to meeting with you, that it's going to make sense for them. Like, maybe just treat them like a human first before you have your ask in mind.
Totally. I think too, like the way I see like sales development, and it's probably just a meta for like everything. It's like, the way I put it is, everything can work. Nothing always works. And so the only interesting thing is like why for both of those, right? And to your point, if you start to ask why did X convert, it's one of the reasons I'm like pro email for like message validation is what I say is like cold calling is a shorter feedback loop and it is higher conversion oftentimes. But what is converting is likability. Like that is, and it doesn't mean like, it's just a different thing. And so it's a way of farming potential appointments. But like, if you set 10 appointments, you can't go back and be like, this was the message that worked. That doesn't exist. That's, every call is a little bit different. And like with spoken communication, so little of it is word selection. It's like there's all these, it's ethos, pathos, logos, right? And it's like most of this is this ethos thing. And the ethos is this connection, shared ethics. I like the way I used to teach this when I was teaching cold calling people all the time was like, there's two goals when you're making a cold call. There's progress the call, everyone knows that, but there's actually a first one, which is align and sort of like get permission to progress. And so what happens is, if you think of cold calling as just like, first I need to basically get that alignment where they're willing to hear me, it's easy as hell to say whatever you do and like you'll get that. But what usually happens is they haven't really quite aligned yet to like, yes, I'm going to hear you and this conversation is going to happen. And then you're trying to like hit them with the thing, trying to move the ball forward, but you'll never do it. Right. And the more, it's why like route room multiply is so focused on like, it's like, you're not going to give anything until that you've gotten them to engage. Part of the reason I think that works is it's like, by the time you're getting like, hey, can I tell you why, okay, cool. Now let me give this to you. You've built that sort of like progression, you've built that traction. And if you handle objections well, and you basically take it that anytime, like a lot of objection handling is like, when they say this. But to me, the biggest objection is like, they're not bought into the conversation yet. And so quite literally a lot of time, if you're like, hey, do you mind if I tell you why I'm calling? And they're like, sure. Right. I bet half of the time when they say that, you'd be better served going, hey, look, I'm gonna be honest. You sound like you're pretty bummed to hear this. Like, would you rather I just don't do this? Like, I'm not trying to steal from your day. I just thought that this might be useful. Right. And like, I bet if you did that, you'll get a bunch of those people who gave you this half-ass shirt and all of a sudden like, damn, okay, what's up? What do you got? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And because you're buying that credibility and you're showing like, I'm a professional, I know what I'm doing, and it's not the talk track, it's not the whatever, but it's sort of like being just like, we were talking about earlier with like me selling my thing, where it's like, I'll call out, hey, look, I don't want you to say yes if you're hearing this, but you actually just think it's going to work. Like, you need to be bought into the model. It's sort of like willing to be a little bit less enthused than the other person and calling it out. Actually helps either like sort of quote unquote force that buy-in, or you're going to help disqualify something sooner. You're going like, hey, it's okay. It's like, I had a cold call, or I had a discovery call like a few weeks ago. That was like literally the worst discovery call I've ever had, like literally. And I told the guy, I was like 7 minutes in, and I was like, dude, I got to tell you, this is by far the worst. And I said, I was like, it wasn't that I was necessarily doing anything. It wasn't bad. It was just true. I was like, I can just tell this isn't resonating with you at all. And I'm like, I've had the same conversation hundreds of times. And like dozens of those times, people have been like, this is amazing, take my money. And so I was like, I can just tell by the way you're reacting that like, we shouldn't work together. Like, this doesn't make sense. And he's like, oh, okay. It was a little awkward, but it was true. you know. And I was like, take time back, we'll go do our thing.
Yeah, that's, I mean, sometimes
Riz
you got to
Dev,
do that.
baby.
Yeah, that is
He got
look.
Riz Dev'd.
he got Rizz down. Oh, that's great. Okay. Is there something most people don't know about you and your business, or you can pick one, that you wish they did know?
It's a good one. I'm inclined to say that everyone, whatever anyone knows about me, I am perfectly excited that that's what they know. That's like probably my
Hmm.
truest answer.
Yeah.
And like probably most people know the right amount based on what I've intended for them to know.
Uh-huh.
But I would say this is, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like, it's a sales development concept is I tell people like, don't assume people care the most about work. Right. And so I'd
Mhm.
imagine that a lot of like the network we share, probably I I don't exactly know what I come off as to the people outside of like my sphere, but I could imagine that they're missing out on a lot of like who I am if they're just getting like an interpretation based off of like LinkedIn posting. You know
Right.
what I mean? And so I don't actually care if anyone is curious by any of that, but I think that there's like a much kind of cooler frequency of life that exists that, you know, you and I get to connect on and stuff like that. And so I would just say if they like any, you know, if they hear pockets of things that sound a little different and interesting, I think they should pull on the thread. That's what I would say.
Gotcha. For sure. Yeah, I mean, everybody who I've spoken with thus far are basically, LinkedIn mutuals,
Yeah.
and a lot of the same people may see this, but what I'm going to start doing is having conversations with some of my close friends who are also in business, either for themselves or doing things that don't exist on like the sliver of LinkedIn that we all interact on. Because again, I just feel like a lot of people are just missing the plot,
Yeah.
and there is a way to go about business that isn't the latest trend from the guy that works at that big company, and it's working for I don't want to like name names because I don't have any, there's no animus, but
Yeah.
there is to me a kind of insular quality
Yeah.
that
I think it's like you have like to me it's like what resonates to me about how you're talking about it is like you have a, you know, flavor of how you like to do things and you have belief behind it. And I think it's like it's not combative to just be like I want to cast light on what that looks like, you know, and like share it with people.
right.
And it's like it's not rooted in like not that, it's just rooted in being this.
Yeah, hey, just so you know, there's other people off this platform who are crushing, and don't
No way.
do any of the things that you're talking about,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but you're talking with like this very firm belief, like this is how you do it. And it's
Well,
like,
one of my actually, an observation of mine that's like a random, like I actually think LinkedIn. So if you think of like the feedback, like chicken or the egg of LinkedIn feedback loop,
mhm,
is like what LinkedIn. I think what happens is like people perpetuate things on LinkedIn, and then that drives what works more than like the other.
mhm,
You know what I mean? So it's like, um, so it's sort of like I think that there's truth to what people when people share things on. If your audience is on LinkedIn, people will behaviorally follow what the LinkedIn meta says works, is I guess what I'm saying.
right.
But you're right that outside of the LinkedIn meta, what works is a very different set of, you know, it can be.
Yeah.
It can be. And there's meta truths to all of it that's probably the best. You know, it's like if you want to become like a talented person, it's like get good at those things.
Right. Right. And it's not like it's not valuable. I totally am. I like social media. I'm like a very online person. I in I follow news stories. I follow art, all because I just am interested. Right. So, but like an example that comes to mind, I cannot remember this guy's name, but he has recently kind of gone viral using YouTube and TikTok. He sells jets. Have you seen
Oh
this
yeah,
guy? Like
yeah,
this
yeah,
kind
yeah,
of this gray haired,
yeah,
maybe Italian guy or something
yeah,
that lives in London and
yeah,
sells these private jets, and didn't have any presence whatsoever. And then it's just like, oh yeah, do this, and then the reason for his virality is partly that it's kind of enigmatic. Like nobody knew that he existed, and I think for me, my visceral reaction was like, I feel like we deserve to know who this person is. How are you just killing it without using, the common path? And how come you're not online and stuff? And it's like, oh wait, there is a world out there
Yeah.
where people
Yeah.
exist doing things. So anyway, maybe that's just me being immature or whatever, but that's where this will eventually go. Is I'm going to be talking to my buddy Ian later today, who is he sells copiers.
Nice.
He's qualified for President's Club last month, and will continue to sell more and more. And he's always done quite well. And he's a gregarious character. Some might say abrasive. He's always been a great friend to me, right? So, but and just kind of slowly introduce, hey, these are some people also who crush, who didn't buy like the latest book and like try to jam it down people's throat, right? So anyway,
no, I love it.
Negative.
I'm always there's irony in the LinkedIn sphere around how monocultural it is.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm always a fan of getting. I wrote this SDR guide. Like was it only just last weekend? That's crazy. If that's true. Wow, it was.
Time
I was
flies.
in West Virginia for a wedding for someone who I met from the Lindy table, and basically a bunch of those people ended up using my like how to get an SDR job guide.
Oh yeah.
Part of like my sort of passion around that was helping get like atypical people into like the remote sales sphere. And it's been really cool because it's funny. It's cool and not, because sometimes you see it's interesting what does and doesn't get perceived as like sameness versus not. Yeah. Right? Because like I've had people who are like, oh, we don't want more people like XYZ, and they're like, yo, I'm like in this little rural town in the middle of fucking like, please don't say you have a bunch like me, because I'm the only person in my entire community who even knows that this exists. So like,
right. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, so I'm a huge fan of the clash of like getting in some of the, adjacent field people and letting it, it's same like, what's that guy? Andy Elliott, right? Do you know Andy Elliott?
Yes. Yeah.
Like he's like a great example, right? Because like Andy Elliott, I actually know someone who's done his trainings before, and he's like that guy, he's literally like, that guy changed my life. He's like, you'll never get me to say something bad, because it's like, it's just interesting, because I think it's so easy to see something from an outside perspective and like have judgments of things, but I don't know. It's just weird. People can be so negative.
Yeah, no, it's true. I actually am. It does make me laugh when he's like, tells people to take their shirt off in front of everyone. But I'm somebody who's overweight. You know what I mean? I would be totally embarrassed on that stage.
Yeah,
It does not feel good. But what I think what he's doing there is like crucially important. And he's making like a different. I'm not saying I totally endorse what this guy. I mean, he has his own background, whatever. But all I mean to say is that we've gotten to a point where to tell the simple truth about a thing is actually, it's like offensive, and it can be offensive. The truth is,
it's not like any of those people who paid to be there.
They all exactly right.
Yeah, so it's funny because people will be like, "Oh my god, these idiots paid $20K," and it's like, well, is it that everyone's an idiot and that this guy who's apparently people are very willing to give tons of money is useless? Or would it be more Occam's razor like if maybe you're missing the point? These people will feel great, It's not you, but just
No, I hear you.
I first came across him because my friend Hate sent it to me. He was like shitting on it, and I watched it because I was like, at first it's kind of like haha, and like he had like a 45-minute YouTube video, and I put it on while I was doing some other work. And the more I listened, I was like, "Oh my god, I like this guy."
Yeah, same thing. I kind of want to not like him, and he does make it easy to not like him. Except for, I'm watching him, I'm like, but isn't he right though? Like,
well, the longer form stuff too, because like the TikTokified stuff is like real intense,
right?
But like his whole message is like, it's. To me, the most disagreeable thing is that I think that it's like incredibly hardo manipulative sales.
Yes,
like,
no,
it's really funny if you watch him do his mathematical breakdown stuff. It's so crazy because he's like, all right, so the way we're gonna do it is like you get them to talk about what's their current car plus this, plus like, and it's like, hold on, this is if I were to take the wisdom of designing commission plans, it would say this is bad because it's too complicated, and I don't believe that Andy Elliott, tight pants, dress shoes,
Yeah.
tight t-shirt, half ripped off. Like, he's not my math tutor.
No, for sure. For
Yeah.
sure not. But um this is another thing about the arts. Like I used to be a DJ for a lot of years, and like there's this thing, when Michael Jackson, people wouldn't play Michael Jackson's music and then wouldn't play R. Kelly's music, um, for these various reasons that are disgusting, and it's terrible that any of it happened. For Mike, I guess, it's still up in the air, but people seem to believe that he did what he did. And then there's like the Harvey Weinstein, and he produced all of these movies that people really like. And I just started asking myself, like, are we going to do this with everything?
Right. Yeah.
I know
Especially as
this might be weird.
context changes, right? Like not for any of those, but just like if you're like extrapolate the idea of like, are we gonna do this for everything? Like, are we gonna do this for everything over time too?
Right.
Right. It
Yeah.
starts to become very like, yeah, I don't know. To me it's art. Yeah. In there, there's lots of like all of the above things where it's like there's things that are objectively enjoyable that are or even, I mean, honestly, you can take away enjoyment too, because this like comes up with like talking about like statues, let's say, right, where it's like there's kind of this like interesting discussion of like, does something's existence equal endorsement, so to speak,
Right.
or does the experience of something equal endorsement versus what might be like, like is like something might just it is, I don't know.
Yeah. You don't have to just, I'm going to say a few things that are controversial. Kellen doesn't necessarily agree with it just because he's on the show, but my take is that art should be separated from the artist, right? And that's my view. I mean, I understand if people don't agree or don't want to do that, especially if it's like you hear crazy accusations and it's like, let's just go play, whatever it is. Like R. Kelly had his thing, like, let's just go play a whole night of R. Kelly. Like, no, I get it. Like, you have an audience to serve. But at the same time, going back to Andy Elliott, just because he's an abrasive character, like, does not mean some of the things that he's sharing aren't valuable. Right. And so there's I take this view on the arts in general that like, for instance, like for the movie the book, Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley, and she existed in this time with all these romantic poets, and her boyfriend, I guess, Percy B. Shelley, was a terrible person. Like, she ended up his current wife ended up like killing herself and her kids and all this stuff. But then this person himself, Percy B. Shelley, created all this beautiful poetry, and then his side chick, Mary Shelley, created Frankenstein while they were out on this trip, basically doing all sorts of debauched things with one another. But then also they were doing this kind of writing contest, so to speak. Like, we're all going to write short stories and we'll see which ones, whose is the best, right? And Frankenstein came out of this thing, which to me is like this is like the first sci-fi. This is like proto sci-fi Frankenstein, and the book is totally different from the movie too. Like, the movie is like, the monster's kind of dumb, whereas in the book he has these feelings of humanity, but he's not human. Anyway, I just think it might serve us better to take a longer view on things and view it in the context in which it existed, and then you can have your thoughts and ideas about it, rather than looking back and totally judging it. That being said, I mean, we should totally judge R. Kelly. That dude's
Well,
crazy.
one of the things to that point is like, I've always thought of it like, it's a positive thing to be able to extract profound insight from like a weak situation.
Yes.
Right. And it's not righteous to say like there's nothing to something. So the idea of being like, that was a dumb story, it did nothing for me, like that doesn't usurp someone else who's like, wow, the way the author wrote about XYZ, I started thinking about this and it made me think about this. And I thought this was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like these two people can on an individual level say like, this is my truth. But like from the outside observing, my argument would be like, it's not better to be the like, I don't get it person.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that there's a lot of like, you know, like society today does a lot of this sort of like, screw that type of thing. Like, who cares? This is dumb. And it's like, that might be true for you. But if someone like just take like music, if someone gets enjoyment out of a song, there's like a normal person and they're like, this song makes me happy.
Right.
If you're like, that song was written by this person, like, screw that. Like, to me, that like, you're participating in a negative thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, that's not cool. And it's fine to say like, hey, for me, you know, people can do whatever they want. But just the idea that it's like inherently true that like there's this black mark on this, you know, on this adjacent thing, and therefore this is like completely untouchable or whatever is, you know, to me, weak.
Yeah. Anyway, starting to digress here. We have been on for a little while. I appreciate you coming on, man. And thank you for chatting with me.
Yeah. Like,
that's it. It's the Rizz Dev Podcast. Thanks, bro.
Thank you. Peace.
Peace.